Hi, and welcome to the Heart of a Perfectionist podcast. I'm your host, Tegan Thompson. I'm a book lover, a chocoholic, and an INTJ living in a world filled with extroverts. I made this podcast to share my experiences and struggles as an introverted perfectionist, and to bring the inner workings of an introvert's mind to introverts and extroverts alike. So grab a cup of tea and get comfortable. It's time to unmute. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Heart of a Perfectionist podcast. My sister just graduated from the U of M yesterday, so that's why the episode is being released today on Sunday instead of Saturday. But just shout out to her, congratulations, so proud of you. This week, as part of the Mental Health Awareness Month mini-series that I am doing, we will be talking about eating disorders. And I kind of just want to start off by talking about what are eating disorders. I know a lot of you, and pretty much every one of you, already know what eating disorders are, but I just kind of want to give a brief overview of it, just in case, maybe there are people out there who don't entirely know what eating disorders are, or maybe there's something you didn't know about eating disorders that will help you kind of have a better understanding of eating disorders. So, eating disorders are complex mental health / psychological conditions that result in unhealthy eating habits. And they often start with an obsession with food or your weight or just like your body shape, kind of your body structure and how it's built. In severe cases, eating disorders can cause serious health consequences, like organ failure, which is really bad. You don't want your organs to fail. And then when left untreated, they can also result in death. Although eating disorders affect all genders and ages, which they do, they can impact literally any person you know. It can be any of your friends, any of your family, any of your coworkers. They can impact literally anyone. They're most prevalent in teenagers and women, so that's why there's a lot of focus on eating disorders for teenagers and women, but that does not discount adults and even like younger kids before teenagers, and then also men. Like obviously men also do experience eating disorders. So what are some causes for eating disorders? So eating disorders actually can be genetic. They have done studies with twins who were adopted by two different families, so they were actually separated, and found that if one twin was diagnosed or developed an eating disorder, that the other twin, who they didn't live together, they didn't experience the same life or anything, was 50% more likely to develop a eating disorder. So they can be genetic. Your personality can also determine if you are likely to develop an eating disorder. Neuroticism, Perfectionism, and Impulsivity are three major parts of a personality that can put you at higher risk of developing an eating disorder. And then also societal and cultural ideals of thinness, which you specifically and primarily see in your Western cultures, in America and in Europe and stuff like that, because cultures that are not exposed to the Western pressures of being thin and having to be thin, in those cultures, eating disorders are significantly less prevalent. So that just shows that the culture and the society that you are surrounded by and partake in can impact whether or not you develop an eating disorder. And then a fourth one is the brain levels of your serotonin and dopamine are potentially a factor in eating disorders. There have been studies that they've started to do to kind of show this. They need to do more studies to like have this as a conclusion and as like an actual cause of eating disorders, but those are things that could potentially be a cause of it, is your serotonin and dopamine levels. So those are just, that is kind of like what eating disorders are and some causes of eating disorders. I'm going to talk about 3 of the most common eating disorders, and then I'm going to talk about a couple lesser known eating disorders, just because I think it's always fun to like introduce people to new things that they maybe didn't know about before. And I know that the most common eating disorders, since they are the most common, pretty much everyone already knows about them, but I do also want to kind of introduce people to some things that maybe they didn't know existed. And before I kind of go into like sharing what these most common eating disorders are, I think it's really, really important to note that there are so many different eating disorders. And even though you probably hear about the top 3 or 4, there are so many more than that. And I think it's really important to kind of understand that. And if you are interested in, learn about the different types, because there are so many different types. And to recognize that, okay, well, I only know about these 3 major ones, and so if you kind of don't have those symptoms, then you don't have an eating disorder, right? So just keeping that in mind and being aware of that and broadening your perspective on what an eating disorder is, and just remembering that it is a condition that results in unhealthy eating habits, and there are a lot of different ways to have unhealthy eating habits. So the first most common eating disorder I know pretty much all of you have probably heard of is anorexia nervosa, which most people just call anorexia. And the common symptoms of it is you're often underweight. Not always. There are exceptions to it, but often people are underweight and they view themselves as overweight. They kind of have this distorted body image of themselves, and view themselves as overweight, and will often kind of deny the fact that they are underweight. They have restrictive eating patterns, so a lot of times they'll avoid certain types of foods, and they will restrict the calories they eat. And when they do that, it's often very low calories that they will eat in a day, way under eating for if they're an adult or whatever age group they are in. And then they will also have an extreme fear of gaining weight. So anorexia is definitely a very dangerous eating disorder, because it puts people at unhealthy weights that puts their whole life at risk. There's a lot of people who do die from anorexia, and so it's very dangerous and very, very important that you seek help if you or someone you know is suffering from anorexia. The second most common eating disorder is bulimia nervosa, which, again, all of you have probably heard of, most often referred to as bulimia. And the symptoms with bulimia are recurrent episodes of binge eating, with often accompanied by feelings of like lack of control with your binge eating. So they will often consume large amounts of food, and kind of get to the point where they're really, really full, like almost to the point where they're like uncomfortably full, and there's just like this feeling of not being able to control your behavior, control this binge eating episode. And then often what happens is after a binge eating episode, they'll have recurrent episodes of purging to prevent weight gain. And the most common way to purge is people will force themselves to vomit. But other ways are people will take like laxatives or something like that to some way of releasing the food content from their body. And their self-esteem is highly influenced by their weight and their body shape. And that's often why they will kind of binge eat and then purge, is because they want so badly to fit this ideal body weight and body shape that they're restricting things. And like a lot of times they'll, similar to anorexia, restrict certain foods, and then like you restrict yourself and now you're like, oh, I really want that, which is what always happens when people restrict food, is that your desire to have that food increases like so much more that eventually these people, they kind of fall into that. And most often binge eating episodes do result in people binge eating foods that they tell themselves they can't have, and then they binge eat all this food, and then they feel really bad. They have probably a lot of shame and kind of disgust associated with it, and in order to prevent the weight gain that they have a fear of, they have a very big fear of gaining weight, they purge and release what they ate so that they don't gain weight. So again, very unhealthy way of eating, and just very unhealthy relationship with food in general. And then the third most common eating disorder is a binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder is very similar to bulimia, excluding the purging behavior. So with binge eating disorder, they will often eat large amounts of food very rapidly and in secret, and they will do this again until they are uncomfortably full, despite them probably not feeling hungry beforehand. So they'll just kind of start eating, and then they'll eat until they're just really uncomfortably full. And again, this is accompanied by feelings of lack of control during the episodes of binge eating, and then also feelings of shame, disgust, or guilt with the binge eating behavior specifically. And again, the difference between binge eating disorder and bulimia is that they don't purge themselves, and then also they don't restrict calories like people with anorexia do. So those are like the three most common eating disorders, and I gave very basic and brief symptoms and overviews of those disorders. There is a lot more complexity that goes into all of those things. So if you are interested in learning about any more of those things, let me know and I can do an episode on it, or you can go and do your own research on it and kind of learn more about those things. So I'm going to talk about two of the lesser known eating disorders. And the first one is called Bigarexia, or muscle dysmorphia. And people with muscle dysmorphia often worry about being too small or frail looking. They don't want to be like really small and tiny, and because of this, it's often referred to as like the opposite of anorexia. Can take in how you want to take it in and determine that for yourself if that's how you view it, but they are afraid of being too small, and this is most often seen in bodybuilders and frequent gym goers, because they often, they want that big muscly appearance, and so they're really afraid of being too small or too frail looking. And then the second one is Orthorexia Nervosa, and this disorder is where you would have compulsive obsession with eating pure and healthy foods. And so often people with orthorexia nervosa obsess over what they're eating, and they obsess over how much they're eating, and they'll even obsess over how the food is being prepared. They want pure, clean, healthy foods, and stuff like that. And a lot of times if they break their own rules, they will punish themselves by making their diet even stricter, or they'll fast for a certain amount of time in order to make up for it or something like that. And so, yeah. So I wanted to mention these two lesser known eating disorders first thing because they are lesser known and not a lot of people know about them. But second, because I wanted to point out that even people who may appear really healthy, people like bodybuilders and people who go to the gym a lot, or people who all the time are eating the healthy foods, can still struggle and be diagnosed with eating disorders. Eating disorders do not discriminate. It does not matter what your gender is, what your age is, what your body type is, what your weight is. Eating disorders do not care. They can impact anyone and cause a lot of struggle and kind of just a lot of pain with people, because it is really hard to have an eating disorder, especially when you become aware of your own eating disorder. So it's really, really important to kind of like make sure that you're not judging people based off of their appearance. You're not looking at someone who's like stick thin and saying, oh, they must have an eating disorder, or looking at someone who looks really fit and really healthy and say, oh, they could not have an eating disorder, right? Because that is not true. Literally anyone can suffer from an eating disorder, and I think that's why it's so important to talk about eating disorders, because there's that stigma surrounding it about that you have to look this certain way to have an eating disorder and stuff like that, or that it's very, very apparent if you have an eating disorder. That's not always true. People are able to keep their eating disorders very secretive a lot of the times, and you may never know unless you pay attention to like those very, very like small, minute details, and it can be really hard, but it's important to stay open-minded around eating disorders and recognize that anyone can be suffering from them. And that's why if someone is, maybe confiding in you and trusting you enough to be able to start talking about or even hint at the fact that they're struggling with their eating habits, it's important to listen to them, despite what you may think about how they may look healthy or how they may appear to be fine. It's important to listen to them, because if they think they're struggling with an eating disorder, more than likely they are, and they need your support and your help, because a lot of times it is a very compulsive thing. It's something that's very controlling, that you don't feel like you can control it yourself. It just kind of happens. You can't stop it. And so if they're reaching out to you for help, they need the help, because for them it's so hard to do it on their own. And that's why with eating disorders a lot of time, like you need to seek treatment. That's so important. Eating disorders are mental health conditions that can like consume people's whole lives, every single area of your life. It just will infect everything in your life. And that's why it's so important to seek treatment and get the professional help, even if that requires you like going to an inpatient treatment clinic, even though that may seem scary. It's so important that you seek out that help, and whatever works best for you, however you can kind of rebuild your relationship with food, because people who have eating disorders have unhealthy relationships with food. And so it's really, really important to rebuild that relationship, find your healthy balance with food, and just eventually become healthy in that aspect. Eating disorders are difficult because they are both mental and physical. They impact they're both like psychologically, you're struggling in that aspect, and then you're also struggling physically, and that's why it's something that often requires inpatient treatment, because you have multiple aspects that you have to work on. It's not just, okay, here is a meal plan so that you can eat better. It's not just that, because it starts in how you think about food and how you think about your body and your weight, and that's kind of where you have to target, because if you don't change how people with eating disorders think and how they approach food, then they're never gonna heal from their eating disorder. So again, it might be scary, it might seem embarrassing, but it's so important to seek treatment, because eating disorders can be deadly and they can cause serious health consequences. So just seek out the people who you can trust and who will support you, because those people are going to be like they're going to be your people for a while, and they're going to be there for you. And it's really important to have that support system. I think that's true for anyone going through any type of mental health condition, that you have that support system, because again, it's not something you can do on your own. You need the guidance and the support and help from other people in your life. So it's really important you find that, and just know that people love you and they're supporting you. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Heart of a Perfectionist podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, or if you learned anything new, please go share it with a friend. And as always, have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you guys again next week on the Heart of a Perfectionist podcast.